I'm a journalist and my job is obviously to cover the story, and I was with the activists from the beginning. They tried in July to be part of a bigger flotilla, but they were stopped by the Greek authorities. So the idea this time was to go secretly, these two boats which had managed to break away from the Greek coastline, go secretly so that they wouldn't be stopped potentially by the Turkish authorities or by anybody who had an interest in stopping them. We got to the south coast of Turkey, and the idea was not to take aid to Gaza. Of course, Gaza needs aid, but the idea was to open up a route so that Palestinians can use their own waters and use international waters to trade with anybody. Because ultimately what Palestinians don't want is to be dependent on aid. They want to be able to trade with the world and stand on their own 2 feet and not be dependent on the whims or the mood in whether it's in Israel or in Egypt. Because if Egypt decides it can close Rafah and Gaza is choked, it's strangled, but using their own waters they can access the whole world. So the idea was not aid, but freedom of movement, freedom of trade, and basically to give Palestinians the rights they deserve. Israel says it no longer occupies Gaza, so it no longer has any authority to control its airspace or its waters, but it does so. So the idea was to challenge that. There was some aid on board the Tahrir, the Canadian boat. It was around $30,000 in medical aid, but it was disguised. It was put in boxes of melons and so on, so that if the authorities came on board before the ships left, they wouldn't see the aid and realize what the whole mission was about. And I believe that the Israelis are saying that they didn't find any aid on board the ships. Now either they're lying or they're incredibly dim and they haven't figured out that the aid was actually disguised in these boxes and they haven't found it yet. So we were approaching Gaza. We didn't stop, we kept going, and on the second night we were getting near the area where the MAVİ MARMARA was attacked. You know, it was attacked around 95 miles, something like this, from the coast. And we thought, you know, by the time before the night is over, we will be attacked by the Israelis. Everybody was quite tense. It was the same feeling that was on board the MAVİ MARMARA before it was attacked. But the next morning we were still there, we were still sailing. Daylight had come and we were still on our route, and we approached the 100 miles between the boats and the coast. And that's where the danger zone is, because even though it's still international waters, we know that Israel has attacked flotilla boats in this area before. So we knew something, if it's going to happen, it will happen in the next few hours. But we kept going at maximum speed. Of course, these are very small boats. They can't go very fast. So maximum speed was around 12 nautical miles per hour. By the time we got around 45 nautical miles from the coast, all our communications were jammed. Satellite phones went down, the internet went down, the radar was jammed. And then we heard the call on the radio from the Israelis asking, "Where are you going?" We saw 2 large warships on one side, another Israeli warship on the other side. And they said, "You cannot go to Gaza, you must go to Ashdod." The organizers kept talking to them, saying, "We have the right to go to Gaza. We are not breaking any laws. We have no intention to harm you. We're not carrying any weapons. We are doing this for the rights of the Palestinians and to help the Palestinians only." The Israelis didn't accept this. More ships came ahead from in front of us, and by the time we were surrounded, there were something like 15 to 20 ships, 5 warships, helicopters, Zodiacs, also ships with water cannons, and some gunboats as well. And they surrounded both the boats. They said, initially they said, "We are going to come on board the boats and we are going to search the boats." But they weren't very clear. So we thought maybe they are going to say, "We'll search the boats." They said, "If we don't find any weapons, we will leave you alone." Now, we didn't believe this. And anyway, the whole point of this is to break the siege. So the organizers said, "We do not give you permission. If the United Nations wants to come, if a third country wants to come and inspect our ships, that's fine. But we do not give you the right, because you do not have the right to search our ships. We are going to Palestine through Palestinian waters." Anyway, the Israelis attacked eventually. They used water cannon on our boat, the Tahrir, and they used 2 water cannons on the Irish boat, the Saoirse, from both sides. They used so much water on the Saoirse that it began to start sinking, because it's a small boat. The generator inside, because it's electric, the water short-circuited and it went on fire inside the boat. And all the time the Israelis were saying, we are doing this in a safe way, we are doing this for your protection and our protection, and so on. It was ridiculous. Then the soldiers came on the boats, and because they'd sprayed them with so much water, they themselves came on the boats and they fell down on the deck. They came on our boat and they tasered 2 of the Canadian organizers, because they were in the control room, in the wheelhouse where the captain is. Then they took our cameras. This was the most important thing for the Israelis, was to take the cameras, take the memory cards, any evidence of what had happened. They wanted to take it from us, but they were filming themselves for their own propaganda purposes. They held us there, they took us inside the boat, and they dragged the boats. They forced us to go to Ashdod. We weren't interested in going to Israel, but they took us to Israel. When we got to Israel, the press, we came off with we weren't allowed to take our cameras, everything, just our clothes. The activists on the Canadian boat said, this is our boat, we do not want to go to Israel, we will stay with our boat. So what happened was the soldiers came, 4 or 5 soldiers grabbed each person, they beat them up and they took them off the boat. And I remember one person, David Heap from Canada, he was injured quite badly. His legs were covered in bruises and cuts where they'd beaten him up and dragged him along the floor. When I got to Ashdod, I thought, because I'm press, maybe they will be easier with me. But in fact, it was the opposite. They searched me more than other people because they knew I'm press and they knew I have some video. For 2 hours, they searched me, everything. They took all my clothes, everything. 10 people were searching my equipment and well, not my equipment, they're taking the equipment, but my suitcase and my clothes. Everybody checking my t-shirts, everything. They x-rayed my clothes. After 2 hours, they found 3 small chips with the footage of what happened. So I lost the footage, and they were successful in censoring the media and stopping the media from reporting what happened. Of course, they gave their own video. The parts which they like, they gave them to Reuters, but obviously we don't have our footage. Then they took us to prison. They tried to make us sign a document which said, I have entered Israel illegally and I want to be deported. They said to me, because you are a journalist, if you sign this document, we will let you go right now. Some of the other journalists, they signed and they were released. But I felt it's against my principles to sign a confession to something that I'm not guilty of. Not only is it against my principles, but it's if I sign it, it's an insult to all the Palestinians in Gaza who are trapped against their will. If I sign and try and escape just for such a small thing, it's a real insult to all the people who are suffering. Their life is trapped. I can suffer a few days if they can suffer so many years in Gaza. So they took us to jail. The jail was like any jail. It was quite dirty, but they didn't abuse us or anything like that. There were a lot of Irish people, and the Irish were very strong. There were 15 of them. They were very strong, and they pushed the Israeli guards back, and they made sure that we got our rights inside the jail. We weren't allowed to contact the outside world, no newspapers, anything like that. I was allowed 1 3-minute phone call to my parents over the period of a week. That's all, the only contact I had. Apart from the British embassy, they came from time to time. Eventually they released me, took me to the Tel Aviv airport in a van. They put me on Turkish Airlines plane. They didn't give me my passport, they gave that to the crew to give to the police in Turkey. When I arrived in Turkey, the police, they listened to my story and they said, okay, they gave me my passport back and they said, you can enter Turkey. I think compared to MAVİ MARMARA, it was different. Of course, what happened in MAVİ MARMARA was very shocking, and it was very emotional because they killed people in front of us. This time they didn't kill anybody, but they imprisoned us for a very small thing, for trying to break the siege with 2 small boats. Relatively, it's a small thing. They sent half the Israeli Navy for 2 small boats, and they kept us there for 1 week. I think the idea was to show that other people, if you try and break this siege, we will make it very difficult for you. We will take everything you have, and we will keep you in prison for as long as we can, as an example to the next people that come. But we know from experience, from MAVİ MARMARA, from this time as well, in the prison, while we were in the prison, the activists were talking about ways to raise funds so that they can send more boats next year. And we know that when Israel does this to people, it actually makes them stronger, because then they realize this is what they're up against. This is why they're fighting to break the siege, because they experience the siege themselves. They experience what it's like to be jailed against their will as political prisoners. So they understand what humiliation is, what it's like to lose your freedom simply for who you are and what you believe. So the idea that the activists had was they wanted to keep up the pressure on Israel. They had 2 boats which were free. The rest are still stuck in Greece or other places. The Greek authorities had stopped them from leaving in July. So these boats were sailing, but they left secretly. They didn't want the Turkish authorities to know. They didn't want any political problems to stop them from going. Even the aid they were carrying, it was only symbolic aid, $30,000 worth of medical aid. They hid it inside boxes of, I think, melons and things like that, so that if the Turkish authorities came on board to inspect the boats, they wouldn't see the aid. They wouldn't know what the mission was. They called it freedom waves, and the idea is to send waves and waves of boats so that the issue of the siege on Gaza will remain in the headlines, or will remain in people's minds. Otherwise, people will forget. There's a lot happening in the world, and they want people to remember that Gaza is still under siege, still under blockade. And they wanted to open up a route for Palestinians, an independent route for them to move throughout the world, trade with the world. Because at the moment, if Rafah is closed, if the Egyptian authorities decide they can close Rafah anytime, most of the time it is closed, and they can choke Gaza. The only way that Palestinians have to trade with whom they want is through international waters and through their own Palestinian waters. Israel says it no longer occupies Gaza, so it has no right to control the airspace or the waters of the Palestinians. So they wanted to break through and open up this route. Of course, they knew that there's a risk the Israelis will attack them, but they said they will keep trying. And even now, after this, they intend to go back, and they intend to keep trying.